Yo, hi! Today we're gonna look at the process behind my second Blender short film, which I titled Nasgor 2017. This project took about 2 months of work, but overall it took about a year and a half if you count the initial idea and planning stage, not to mention the countless scrapped ideas. This video is more of a breakdown of my process and not a full tutorial. I go over the key points while trying to explain as much as possible in detail. So, without further ado, let's go. The first sparks of inspiration came after watching this short film by William Gran titled Takeout. I wanted to create a short film with a similar vibe. No dialogue, no human characters, but some sort of story that is clearly present. At that point, I've been using Blender for 3 years, so I was pretty confident in my technical skills. However, a lot of my 3D renders before this point lacked any artistic value. Most of these are just showcases of technical skill and nothing more. I rarely thought about telling a story through these images that I could create from basically nothing on a free piece of software. So when you think about it like that, the possibilities of what you can create seem endless. So after a lot of brainstorming, the idea was to create a short film using Blender, over a minute in length, with food as one of the main subjects, as well as focusing on mood and atmosphere. Inspired by cyberpunk and dystopian imagery, mainly from the web series Dynamo Dream by Ian Hubert, and 1995's Ghost in the Shell. Maybe a bit of Evangelion, Blam, and Akira as well. And of course Cyberpunk Edgerunners. Too many inspirations to name, man. Now I can't animate humans, so the main subject will be a robot. No dialogue because I can't voice act and can't afford actual voice actors. I'll go for realism using Eevee because my PC will die if I use cycles. I wanted to first make the robot that will be the main subject of the short film. I think this was my first time seriously trying out making something using kit bashing. It was really fun. You'll be surprised at how many free assets you can find if you look hard enough. Surprisingly, I didn't need to purchase any assets or add-ons to make this project. Not that I could anyway, but the point is, the internet is big AF, and if you search long enough, eventually you're bound to find that one high-quality free asset that you need. Making the robot from start to finish took about 2 months. From modeling and kit bashing all the way to rigging. Through the process, I often forgot that I'm making something that looks visually appealing, not something that needs to physically work in real life. I spent too much time making sure the joints could realistically fit into each other, when really no one would pay attention to that. It's a model for a short film. It doesn't have to have realistic robot parts. It just has to look cool. Of course, don't have this mindset if you're making a 3D print or realistic model. This is just for making models that purely have to look good. By the way, if you're rigging a robot or something that doesn't have any deforming parts, don't use armature parenting. It's way more efficient and less heavy on your system to simply parent the objects to the bones. The robot I made here doesn't have any organic deforming parts, so none of these objects are parented using the armature modifier, except for the pipes or cables, which are curves that are parented to hooks. After the robot, which is the main subject of the short film, it was time to create the location for the subject. I made at least 6 different blend files that were ultimately scrapped. These were mainly for finding the composition and playing around with layout. I even used Krita, which is an amazing 2D painting program by the way, to try and create a good composition. A lot of time was spent struggling to get a feel of the setting. No matter how many compositions I tried, I never really got one that I was really happy with. I even almost gave up at this stage. So I shifted my focus from creating a nice big location where everywhere looks photogenic to just creating one good shot first. Once I got that one shot, I could expand it from there. Start small so you don't get overwhelmed. In the end, I decided to have the setting be this shopping area, split into 2 streets connected by a rotating bridge. The final layout was heavily influenced by this short titled Street Food, which is really cool by the way. I drew a very basic storyboard in Krita to serve as my guide for the flow of the scenes. It's not a perfect blueprint to follow, but more of a rough idea on how the story plays out. In the end, I didn't completely follow the original storyboard and ended up improvising some scenes. I also used PureRef to collect some reference for the visuals. There are photos from Unsplash, Pinterest, and amazing artwork from ArtStation that helped me a lot as reference for the visual design. And so, equipped with a storyboard and references, it was time to start actually making stuff. First, open Blender. Second, Yeah! Looking at a new clean 3D viewport gives the same dread as starting a painting on a completely empty canvas. There are no landmarks, no guidelines, no structures to build off of. It's extremely daunting to build stuff when there's nothing to start from. The expectation of the scene in my head always looks better than what I can create within the first 5 minutes. I always expect it to be perfect from the get-go, which is completely unrealistic and just don't think that way. But I eventually started creating. First, a blockout using basic cubes to represent shapes, using basic operations such as move, extrude, and scale to create those shapes. Also, having an accurate size human reference helps a lot. Thanks, Ivan. The next challenge is building a scene where multiple camera angles can work. Usually in 3D, you don't model what the camera doesn't see. However, I didn't have a super clear image of where the camera angles would be yet. So for optimization, I created a blockout larger than what I would realistically need. Then added a sunlight that would be visible in almost all scenes. After that, smaller detail would be added only where the camera could see. Once I had the blockout, adding detail was easy. I stick with the big, medium, small principle. Start with your big primary shapes first, as they can act as a base, and then move on to the secondary and tertiary shapes. This applies to other media like painting and drawing too. Most of the buildings are simple cube shapes. Extrude, loop cut, and bevel are very useful operations to make these structures. I use image textures of buildings to create the illusion of detail, a method popularized by Ian Hubert. A simple cube project and moving around UV islands already create great results. You can then add loop cuts in places like windows or overhangs, then extrude them from there. These are only good for medium to far shots though, because close-ups need more geometry to look believable. Man, I miss when textures.com had free downloads. This bridge was modeled in a similar way, utilizing cube shapes and image textures. Rigging it was quite fun too. I even added a noise modifier to the animation to make it feel like an old worn down bridge that could collapse anytime soon. That's not a fun thought. Most of the detail is free assets downloaded from places like Polyhaven, Sketchfab, and CG Trader. The asset browser in Blender is extremely useful for being able to quickly preview and drop assets in your scene. I only modeled a few specific things for the shot, such as the robot, the frying pan, which is an old model that I made, and the delivery drone. To create depth and atmosphere, I used volumetric fog. It's not as versatile in EV compared to cycles, but it is possible to achieve great results using shader nodes. For example, a gradient texture to play around with the shape of the fog. That's what I use to make the fog fade from thick to thin in the background, as you can see here. You can also use a noise texture to add that extra wow factor to your volume. The smoke effects, such as the ones on the pan, are mostly 2D planes or cars. Just videos of smoke on a black background, carefully placed to give the illusion of volume. I also use this free Smoke and Fire Effects Geometry Nodes asset from the official Blender Studio website. This was really useful for creating the cooking scene. It gives great results while also being relatively light on performance, as it's all using nodes, so it's procedural without any simulations needed. Once you start laying down stuff, you almost automatically know what else to add. Adding more objects, editing existing ones, and so on. Again, the big, medium, small principle. Now, it's important to remember that while small detail is nice, it's the big shapes that ultimately carry your composition. I've fallen into the endless loop of adding unnecessary detail multiple times while making this project. In fact, getting lost in adding detail can end up resulting in less detail. For example, in this wide shot, I originally wanted to model the inside of every shop to make it more, realistic. However, I ended up making these people walk around, which are also free assets by the way, making the focus on these people moving instead of the static shops. When you look at this, you think, wow, there's even people walking, instead of, wow, that's a very nicely modeled shop. By the way, there are only like 5 human characters that form all of the crowds walking. I made a procedural shader setup that changed the colors every time you duplicate them. There's also some static humans with a simple rig that makes them sort of breathe a little. Just adds that extra bit of realism. I myself love adding small detail, such as the running neon signs, the flying cars in the background, and this random video of Araki, the creator of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, getting soaked. But you always gotta focus on the big picture first. I cannot stress that enough. And don't forget to add mods for realism. I set the entire short film to be at night, which is arguably harder than daytime lighting in EV. I started with a very dim HDRI that honestly almost does no effect. You could just use a dark world background and it would look the same. Then a sunlight with a low strength and big angle value to create soft shadows. They're non-contact shadows too if you're using EV. That paired with ambient occlusion can create a lot of depth, especially in scenes where objects intersect, such as the space between buildings and the ground that it's on. After that, it's a matter of placing point lights, spotlights, and area lights where it fits. For example, in areas with tons of neon signs, you can put lights to accompany them too, because emission materials in EV don't actually produce light. You can bake the lights with a radiance volume, but that won't work for animations. Yeah, the lighting process is basically trial and error, figuring out what works and what doesn't. By the way, these neon signs are one of my favorite things ever. Some of them are image textures with emissive and transparent materials according to the light and dark values of the image. They're relatively low poly but are quite taxing on RAM because, shaders. Aside from those, there are these rectangular running text signs. These are all the same material. It's a procedural setup where a random value based on the object name chooses one of these 16 textures to use. Basically, the random value shifts the UV coordinates in increments, so it lands on one of these 16 locations. The random value also varies the speed that the sign moves in and the color of each sign. This results in unique signs every time you duplicate them. A simple but great method to create the illusion of variety. Also, yes, I made this custom texture myself and most of this text is stupid. I first learned this method from Ian Hubert and it's extremely helpful. Now let's talk about an often overlooked part of production, which is organization, as in neatly storing files and assets. In all of the blend files for this project, I sorted the objects into collections of, again, big, medium, and small objects. I put the camera and lights in their own collection, and sometimes I add an extra collection for moving objects and hidden items. Good organization can speed up the process by making it easy to access what you need. It also helps a lot with optimization. For example, when previewing or working on an animation, the unneeded background objects can make playback extremely slow. If the background is its own collection, you can simply disable it while you work on other things. Bad organization can lead to laggy performance, which leads to loss of motivation. A helpful feature for organization and optimization is the link function. I found out about this feature quite late into the project and honestly, I wish I knew about it sooner. Linking makes performance so much better. The way it works is you link an object or collection from another blend file, with all the animations, particle systems, and simulations already baked in, meaning your computer doesn't need to spend time recalculating everything. For example, in most of the cooking shots, the robot cooking is a link collection from a separate blend file, which I linked into the file with the street location. So I could work on the robot cooking on its own blend file without any of the background objects distracting me and slowing down performance. The benefit is, of course, increased performance, as it's less taxing on computer resources. And the downside is you can't directly edit these linked items. You have to first close the current file, then open the file where the linked item is, edit it there, save, then reopen the file where you link that item. It can be kinda confusing at first, but trust me, it's a lifesaver during production. Originally, I didn't plan to have this ending shot with the delivery drone at all. At the time, I hadn't figured out a good ending shot. So after making the scene with the robot guy closing the food box, the idea for some other kind of robot picking up an order appeared. Eventually, the story, if you could call it, expanded from just a robot dude cooking fried rice in some random city to it preparing a food order for the customer at the end of the short film. It was a good way to end the short film, in my opinion. By the way, this dude at the end is just a Mixamo character with a sci-fi hard surface asset slapped on his head. I utilized the NLA Editor to mix different Mixamo animations together, a method I learned from this great tutorial video. Overall, I enjoyed the production process in Blender. There were, of course, a lot of problems, but I learned a lot, both technically and artistically. It was also nice not having a deadline, as this was purely a personal project. That way, I could work on it whenever I had free time and felt like it. So, after almost 2 months of production in Blender, it was time for compositing, or post-processing, whatever you want to call it. I actually did some compositing a little bit during production, but that was just to preview the flow of scenes and test out color grades. Before this project, I would always render image sequences in PNG format. But after watching this video by Polyfjord, which is an amazing video by the way, I almost always rendered only in EXR. An EXR file with DWAA or DWA compression has a smaller file size than PNG, and the quality loss from compression isn't even noticeable. EXR also has the benefit of saving more color data. If a shot is overexposed, for example, it can easily be fixed without any loss of data in the bright areas. The same applies to underexposed or dark shots. You can preview EXR files using the open source software DJV. Link is in the description. I compiled all my renders in DaVinci Resolve. I mostly followed the original order in the storyboard, but a few changes were made according to what works best in my opinion. Color grading was first done manually on each shot, then I slapped a big color grade on an adjustment layer above. Then on another adjustment layer above that are all the filters that really create the mood that I was looking for. Among those are noise, lens distortion, lens dirt, and chromatic aberration. Thankfully, compositing took way less time than production. After I'm satisfied with the visuals, it was time to do sound design. Shout out to a friend of mine for helping with tips on how to do sound design. Go ahead and check his stuff out here. Most of the sounds I got were from free sound or downloaded from YouTube. But some I recorded myself, such as this video of me cooking. That turned out quite good by the way. It was mostly just layering different sounds together, starting with ambience, then more ambience, then the sounds of whatever is on screen, and maybe off screen. Some cool effects you can use are the equalizer. Eliminating high frequencies can create the illusion of sound coming from a neighboring room. Eliminating the low frequencies can make the sound seem far away. Adding reverb adds that extra layer of depth. Distortion can make a radio or phone call effect. You can also play with the pan, adjusting volume of the left and right channels independently. This can be used, for example, for a car passing by. Honestly, sound design took the least amount of time out of all the steps in this process. I had a lot of fun doing sound design. It feels really good seeing something move on screen and hearing the correct sound accompany it. Sound is definitely something to not be overlooked when making any video, short film or not. It's equally as important as visuals. So with that done, now let's talk about some problems that I faced while working on this project. Number 1. Poor optimization. This project was quite ambitious for me. I wanted to have multiple shots in the same location, so I thought, why not reuse the same blend file for different shots? And that was a big mistake. The lag caused by having multiple cameras, multiple animated objects, and hundreds of shaders in the same file was horrendous. Every time I wanted to work, it took at least 5 minutes for all the shaders to compile together. Animating anything was a nightmare. I was constantly worried if the file would get too heavy and my computer would explode. Take a listen to it rendering. So, how would I do things differently? Linking. Like I said before, I only utilized linking quite late into the project, but it saved so much time and computing power. Being able to work solely on one part at a time was extremely helpful in the long run. Sure, you need to close and reopen Blender to refresh the linked objects, but at least the animations are baked in, so there's less computing power needed. Optimization can be tiring if you actively have to keep it in mind, because yes, it can limit creativity. But it's absolutely worth it for the long run. Optimize your projects. Number 2. Hardware limitation. This sort of ties into the previous point. My current PC is almost 4 years old. The specs, mainly the Ryzen 5 3600 CPU, GeForce 1660 Super GPU, and 16 gigs of RAM, still hold up for most programs and games today. So it's in no way a bad setup and I'm happy with it. But due to this project being quite ambitious, it did set a limit on what I could work on before performance started suffering. I kept geometry as low poly as possible, and thankfully, playback in solid view was good because of that. But shaders created a lot of lag. I used a lot of image textures, which in turn ate up my RAM. Playback was usually at 10 FPS or even lower. Working with anything animation or simulation related was very hard. However, limitation spawns creativity. I ended up having to find workarounds to problems. For example, utilizing dim lighting to hide the lack of detail, cranking up motion blur to, again, hide the lack of detail, and then duplicating assets and slightly rotating them to create the illusion of variety, and a lot of little things that don't seem to do much, but they really help a lot. Number 3. Forgetting about reference. Reference is the base before the base of a project. Often it's only used at the beginning, then scrapped later down the line. I did this too, thinking I knew what the inside of a building looks like, or what bridges look like, or what freaking fried rice looks like. And this can lead to unrealistic looking models. So if you're unsure on what a real object looks like, go back and look at your reference. Your future self will thank you. Number 4. Fireflies. By far the worst technical problem. For some reason in Eevee, rendering shiny objects in dark backgrounds leads to these weird, extremely bright spots. It gets worse if the bloom setting is enabled. Almost every time I rendered or played back a scene, these fireflies would appear seemingly out of nowhere. There are multiple causes for this and it can happen in cycles too. But for some reason it doesn't seem to be a widespread problem, as I couldn't find many forums with the same issue online. I couldn't find a single reliable fix, but tweaking some settings that could help are: first, adjusting the render sample count. Sometimes more samples leads to more fireflies or the opposite effect. I don't know why this happens. Number 2, adjusting screen space reflection settings. I don't know what most of these settings mean, but playing around with them can remove fireflies in certain cases. Number 3, turning down bloom radius. Bloom is the glow around bright objects. If you set a cap to this, then there won't be extremely big bright areas in your scenes. And last, don't set material roughness to 0. Anything above 0.05 should be better. For some reason, this seems to be the best fix. Maybe it's to remove those extremely sharp highlights that come from shiny objects. Man, I've lost so much time, renders, and sanity to this problem. I really hope it gets fixed in future Blender releases. And that's about it. That's my process. Hope you enjoyed watching this breakdown video. Hope you got something out of it, maybe even inspiration to start your own short film. Go check out Nasgor 2070. Every view means a lot. Link is in the pinned comment. Thanks so much for sticking to the end of the video. At the moment, I don't have a social media other than YouTube for my 3D works, so like and subscribe for hopefully more content like this in the future. Okay, bye.